He had always believed that money could solve every problem. For Alexander, a self-made millionaire, life was a series of transactions, buying companies, acquiring real estate, ensuring everything he touched multiplied in value. But nothing in his meticulous calculations could prepare him for the sickness that struck his children. It started subtly, a cough here, a low fever there, and then it escalated into a condition no doctor seemed to understand. Alexander spared no expense, consulting specialists across the globe, hiring private research teams, funding experimental treatments that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. Each consultation left him both desperate and exhausted, traveling between appointments and hospitals with an anxious heart, clutching his children close as if sheer presence could shield them from the invisible enemy. Every injection, every serum, every device he purchased was meant to be a lifeline, and yet the results were discouraging. The doctors remained uncertain, their expressions polite but grim, their eyes betraying doubts they could not put into words. Alexander's obsession grew. He began to isolate himself from his board meetings, from social events, from the very life that had once defined him. His wife, Elena, tried to stand by him, but even she felt the strain, seeing the toll on his face, the way his confident demeanor crumbled in the sterile white corridors of hospitals. And yet, there was one presence in the house that went largely unnoticed, one who moved quietly in the background while Alexander chased hope through every scientific breakthrough and every experimental protocol. Her name was Maria, the housemaid who had worked for the family for over a decade. She was not just a caretaker of the house. She was a silent observer of its pulse, understanding its rhythms, its secrets, its unspoken sorrows. While Alexander's mind raced through medical journals and phone calls with specialists, Maria noticed things that others overlooked: the subtle pallor of the children, the way they hid small injuries, the quiet way they flinched at certain treatments, and the little inconsistencies that even the doctors missed. She watched Alexander spend his fortune, his pride, his sanity, and she wondered whether wealth was enough to heal what could not be measured in charts or tests. One evening, as the children slept, Maria stayed behind in the nursery, tidying toys with gentle care. She noticed a small notebook tucked under the mattress, a diary of sorts, filled with the children's private words and drawings. As she flipped through the pages, a cold realization washed over her. The symptoms that Alexander had been frantically treating were not as they seemed. The children were suffering, yes, but the root cause was something no doctor had addressed, something that the sterile white corridors and high-tech equipment could never touch. It was emotional, subtle, yet profound, woven into their daily lives in ways that money and medicine could not fix. Maria's mind raced. How could she tell Alexander, whose entire existence had become consumed by the battle to save them? She understood his pride, his desperation, his need to control every variable, but the truth had to be shared. That night, she prepared herself, rehearsing words in silence as she imagined his reaction. Would he blame her for discovering it? Would he resent the simplicity of the answer that had eluded the world's most expensive doctors? As dawn approached, Maria knocked softly on his bedroom door, her hands trembling slightly. Alexander, bleary-eyed and drained, looked up with the kind of exhausted hope that only parents fighting for their children could understand. "Sir," she said gently, "I think I understand what's happening with the children. It's not what the doctors are treating." His brow furrowed, his body tensing. But there was also a glimmer of curiosity, the spark of a man who had spent every resource searching for the truth. Maria explained what she had observed, the small details that others overlooked, the patterns in the children's behavior, the emotional triggers that no medication could heal. She spoke with compassion, not judgment, careful to show that her discovery was meant to aid, not accuse. Alexander listened, initially skeptical, then increasingly aware of the signs that had always been there, overlooked in the blur of wealth and urgency. As the realization settled in, his hands clenched in a mix of relief and remorse. He had been so focused on external solutions, so desperate to apply his resources, that he had missed the simplest, most human truth. And yet, Maria's intervention had opened the door to healing. In that quiet morning light, Alexander realized that his housemaid, the one he had often taken for granted in the whirlwind of his life, had become the guide he desperately needed. The fortune he had spent could not buy the insight, the patience, or the empathy that Maria brought to the table. And in that moment, he understood that wealth alone was powerless against certain kinds of suffering. The first steps toward recovery would not be measured in dollars or high-tech machines, but in attention, understanding, and love, the kind that Maria had quietly nurtured all along. Alexander sat in the study, staring blankly at the financial reports he had brought home, though his mind was nowhere near numbers or profits. The previous morning's revelation had unsettled him more than any business failure ever could. Maria's words echoed in his mind. It wasn't the treatments, the injections, or the experimental medicines that the children truly needed. It was something he had overlooked entirely, something as simple and yet as fragile as emotional connection and understanding. For years, he had been absent in the ways that mattered most, assuming that his presence could be replaced by tutors, specialists, and luxuries. He had believed that love could be measured in the grandeur of a room, the toys that filled it, the vacations taken, and the meals delivered by Michelin-star chefs. But now he saw the truth. Money could create comfort, it could buy attention, but it could not heal loneliness or fear in a child's heart. Alexander rose and walked to the nursery, where soft morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long, delicate shadows across the floor. His children were awake, their little faces pale but brighter than before, the subtle relief of acknowledgement apparent in their eyes. He approached them cautiously, unsure of how to bridge the distance years of distraction had created. "Good morning, my loves," he said quietly, his voice low but sincere. The children looked up, startled at the tone, a warmth they weren't used to hearing. They hesitated for a moment, as if testing the waters, before slipping into small smiles that barely touched their eyes but were enough to move him. Maria, standing quietly by the doorway, gave him a nod of encouragement. She had been a silent guardian all this time, seeing through the layers of wealth, fear, and pride, and she knew this moment had to come from him. Alexander knelt down, placing his hands gently on his children's shoulders. "I've been wrong," he admitted, words that felt strange and heavy on his tongue. "I thought I could fix everything with money. I thought I could make you better by spending on treatments, by hiring the best doctors, by everything. But I realize now that what you needed was me, really me." The children stared at him, absorbing the sincerity in his voice, unsure if this was some fleeting promise or the start of a change that could last. One of them, the older child, whispered softly, "You were always busy, Daddy. We didn't know if you cared." The words hit harder than any failure in business, slicing through layers of self-delusion. Alexander swallowed, fighting the lump in his throat. "I do care," he said, his voice trembling. "More than anything. And I want to make it right. Not with money, not with treatments alone, but by being here, truly here, with you." Over the next few hours, the family began something tentative but profound. They started talking. Alexander listened without interruption, absorbing details about their fears, their frustrations, their loneliness. He learned about the small humiliations they had suffered in silence, the moments of sadness hidden beneath the surface, the nights when they cried quietly because they missed him. Each revelation was painful, each confession a reminder of what his wealth had failed to provide. But with every word, Alexander felt a strange, healing shift inside him, a combination of guilt, relief, and determination that money had never inspired. Maria stayed nearby, offering quiet support without intruding. She knew the delicate balance of intervention. Her role was no longer simply caretaker, but guide, helping Alexander navigate the complex terrain of emotions he had long ignored. By midday, Alexander had made a decision. He would restructure his life around them. The board meetings, the endless conference calls, the international travel, all of it would be secondary to being present. He would not abandon his responsibilities entirely, but the children would come first, their needs no longer filtered through the lens of finance or prestige. In the afternoon, he organized a small family activity, something simple, nothing bought or ordered, just time together. They painted, laughed, and talked, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt the richness of connection that no bank account could replicate. Later, as the evening sun dipped behind the skyline, he called the specialists again. This time, he spoke not as a desperate father offering unlimited funds, but as a parent seeking advice on emotional therapy, counseling, and holistic care. He wanted guidance, not solutions to be purchased. The response from the doctors was cautious but optimistic. They understood the importance of emotional support in recovery, and they began to shift their approach accordingly. Meanwhile, Maria quietly returned to her duties, arranging the home in a way that encouraged comfort and calm. She watched Alexander from a distance, noticing the subtle changes, the way he asked his children questions without judgment, the gentle patience in his voice, the attentiveness that had been absent for far too long. She smiled to herself, knowing that wealth had played its role, but understanding, empathy, and presence were the true catalysts of healing. That night, after tucking the children into bed, Alexander sat by the window alone, reflecting on the day. The weight of guilt still pressed on him, but it was tempered by a growing sense of hope. He realized that the path forward would not be easy. The scars of neglect and misunderstanding could not vanish overnight. But he also understood that acknowledging his mistakes, listening without interruption, and being present were the first steps toward true recovery. Maria knocked softly on the door, holding a tray of tea. "You did well today, sir," she said quietly. Alexander looked up, a mixture of gratitude and humility in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "You did it yourself. I only showed you what you were missing." They shared a brief, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement that some truths could only be seen by those who cared enough to notice. And as Alexander sipped his tea, looking out at the city lights below, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known. The fortune he had spent chasing elusive cures had brought him nowhere, but the wisdom of a housemaid had led him to something infinitely more valuable: understanding, presence, and the first steps toward genuine healing. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander's life began to transform in ways he had never imagined. The once orderly schedule of board meetings and financial negotiations gave way to mornings spent helping his children with breakfast, afternoons walking them to parks, and evenings reading bedtime stories instead of reviewing contracts. The house, once filled with luxury and silence, now echoed with laughter, chatter, and the quiet hum of familial presence. Yet Alexander knew the road ahead was far from easy. The emotional wounds in his children were deep, woven into years of feeling overlooked, and healing them required patience he had never needed in business. Maria, ever vigilant, guided him carefully. She noticed the children responding differently to various approaches. Some needed encouragement, others gentle discipline, and some simply required the reassurance that their father's love was constant, not transactional. Alexander spent hours listening, learning the smallest details about what made them feel secure and what triggered fear. He began noticing things that had escaped him before: the way his daughter avoided eye contact when anxious, the subtle tension in his son's shoulders when pressured, the fleeting moments of sadness masked by forced smiles. He documented these observations privately, not as a businessman seeking strategy, but as a father seeking understanding. One afternoon, Alexander arranged a small family trip to the countryside. The children were initially hesitant, suspicious that yet another plan was just a fleeting distraction. But Maria helped ease the tension, organizing a simple picnic with homemade sandwiches, blankets, and games that required no money but encouraged engagement. As they arrived, the children's eyes lit up in wonder at the open fields, the chirping birds, and the freedom of space. Alexander joined them fully, running, laughing, and playing in ways he had never allowed himself to do. He realized that in all his years of wealth, he had forgotten how simple joys could create lasting memories. As the day passed, Alexander noticed his son drawing in the dirt with a stick, sketching figures that mirrored the family he now sought to rebuild. His daughter ran ahead, calling back to him with genuine delight, and for the first time, he felt the weight of connection replacing the burden of guilt. That evening, as they returned home, Alexander sat alone in the study once more. He reflected on how much he had spent on treatments that only addressed symptoms, not the root of the problem. He realized that the cure was not in wealth or medical expertise, but in presence, attention, and empathy, the very things Maria had been demonstrating all along. Maria entered quietly, carrying a small notebook she had prepared. "Sir, I've been tracking the children's progress," she said softly, laying it on the desk. "Not medical records, but emotional milestones. Small steps, but important ones." Alexander flipped through the pages. There were notes on moods, reactions, and triggers, along with suggestions for encouraging communication and confidence. He realized that this meticulous attention to detail, combined with patience and love, was more effective than any treatment he had purchased. Days turned into routines, and routines into habits. Alexander learned to listen without interrupting, to ask without judging, and to respond with compassion rather than authority. He spent hours in quiet conversation, letting his children lead discussions about their feelings, fears, and dreams. Slowly, the tension that had once dominated their home began to ease. There were setbacks, of course, moments when old habits and fears surfaced, tears when frustration overwhelmed them, and nights when sleep was elusive. But Alexander learned to embrace these moments, understanding that progress was not linear and that healing required patience. He realized that his greatest mistake had not been spending money or seeking help. It had been assuming that wealth alone could substitute for presence. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Alexander's daughter confided a fear she had kept hidden for years. "I was scared you didn't care," she whispered. Alexander's chest tightened. He took her small hand in his, holding it firmly but gently. "I care more than anything," he replied, voice steady but emotional. "And I will always be here, truly here, from now on." Maria, observing from the doorway, allowed herself a quiet smile. The father had finally learned what she had known all along, that love was not demonstrated through spending, but through understanding, listening, and being present in moments that truly mattered. In the weeks that followed, Alexander began to integrate this understanding into other aspects of life. Business calls were shorter, more focused, leaving more room for family. Trips were planned around shared experiences rather than networking opportunities. Even social events were adjusted to ensure the children felt included and valued. Slowly, the children's health, both emotional and physical, began to show improvement. Doctors noted changes in behavior, stress levels, and overall well-being. Alexander realized that while money had granted access to treatment, it was presence and emotional engagement that provided the real healing. One quiet morning, Alexander found himself in the kitchen, making pancakes with his children under Maria's careful guidance. Flour dusted the counters, laughter filled the air, and for the first time, he felt a sense of normalcy that had long eluded him. He glanced at Maria, who simply nodded, a gesture acknowledging the transformation she had helped facilitate. Alexander understood that he owed her more than gratitude. She had been the catalyst that turned desperation into understanding, wealth into connection, and fear into hope. That evening, as he tucked his children into bed, Alexander whispered promises of love, attention, and presence. The children, once hesitant and guarded, now hugged him tightly, trusting in the sincerity of his words. He felt a profound sense of purpose he had never known in boardrooms or luxury villas. Outside, the city lights shimmered, reflecting a world he had conquered financially but had only now begun to navigate emotionally. Inside, in the warmth of the home he had rebuilt, Alexander realized the true meaning of wealth. It was not the fortune he had spent, but the love, attention, and guidance he had learned to give, thanks to the quiet wisdom of the housemaid who had seen the truth before anyone else. And as he finally sat down to rest, a sense of calm washed over him, a recognition that the most valuable investments are never in dollars, but in moments shared, trust built, and hearts healed. Weeks had passed since Alexander's awakening to the truth, and the house that once echoed with tension and uncertainty now vibrated with warmth, laughter, and life. The children were thriving, not just physically, but emotionally. The subtle anxieties that had plagued them for years were slowly melting away under the steady, consistent presence of their father. Alexander had learned to listen with patience, to respond with empathy, and to place love above pride or perfection. He no longer measured success by wealth or influence, but by the joy and trust in the eyes of his children. Maria, ever vigilant, continued to guide quietly, always observing, always supporting, ensuring that the fragile balance of trust and care remained intact. She knew that her role was not to be in the spotlight, but to empower Alexander to be the father his children needed. One sunny morning, Alexander suggested a family outing to the local community center where the children could interact with others their age. Unlike previous excursions, this trip was not extravagant. No private vehicles, no security detail, no lavish gifts. Just the family, walking hand in hand, exploring simple pleasures together. The children, initially hesitant, soon found themselves laughing with other children, playing games, and sharing stories. Alexander watched, heart swelling, as they navigated the world with confidence and curiosity. He realized that this simple exposure, this presence, was more valuable than any experimental treatment he had purchased in desperation. Later that afternoon, as they returned home, Alexander paused at the doorway to watch his children unpack their small treasures from the outing. Their faces glowed with happiness, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of completion, a feeling that all his frantic efforts had finally found purpose. Maria approached him quietly, her eyes reflecting satisfaction and relief. "They're doing well," she said softly. "Better than I expected." Alexander smiled, not at her praise, but at the understanding that it was her insight that had guided him here. "We all are," he replied. The day faded into evening, and Alexander decided to host a small gathering at home, a family dinner, simple yet heartfelt. He invited a few close friends, but the focus was entirely on the children. As they dined, Alexander spoke openly with his children about the journey they had shared. "I know I've made mistakes," he said. "I thought I could fix everything with money. I thought that buying the best treatments and doctors would be enough. But I was wrong. I now see that love, attention, and understanding are what truly heal. And I promise to always be here for you, in every way that matters." The children listened intently, their eyes wide with emotion. They had waited so long to hear these words spoken sincerely, and now, at last, they felt the depth of their father's commitment. After dinner, they gathered in the living room for a quiet evening of games and conversation. Laughter echoed, stories were shared, and Alexander noticed how his children now freely expressed themselves, unburdened by the fear of being ignored or dismissed. Maria sat nearby, observing with quiet pride, her presence a comforting constant. She had guided, she had nudged, but the transformation had come from Alexander's willingness to see, to learn, and to change. Later that night, Alexander tucked his children into bed. He lingered at their doors, watching them drift into peaceful sleep. The sight brought tears to his eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude and profound relief. He had finally discovered the truth that wealth alone could not teach, that love, patience, and presence are the real cures for the wounds that medicine cannot reach. Alone in the study afterward, he reflected on the journey. He realized that every fortune spent chasing treatments, every sleepless night in hospitals, had led him here, but none of it would have mattered without Maria's insight and guidance. She had seen the truth before anyone else and quietly illuminated the path toward healing. He walked to the window and gazed at the city below, now seeing it differently. The skyscrapers, the luxury, the symbols of wealth, they were achievements, yes, but they paled in comparison to the simple, irreplaceable joys of connection and family. Alexander made a vow to himself. He would never again allow the pursuit of success to overshadow what truly mattered. The next morning, he approached Maria, handing her a small envelope. "You've done more for us than I could ever put into words," he said. "This is a token of my gratitude, not for the work, but for the guidance, the insight, and the care that changed our lives." Maria hesitated, touched, but shook her head gently. "Sir, I did what any of us would do for someone who cares enough to listen. The reward is seeing your family whole again." Alexander smiled, understanding the humility behind her words. He knew that some lessons could never be bought, only observed and internalized. In the following weeks, the family continued to flourish. The children became more confident, expressive, and joyful. Alexander balanced his responsibilities with presence, ensuring that nothing overshadowed the needs of his children. He had learned that wealth could open doors, but it could not replace attention, patience, and love, the things that created real healing. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Alexander's daughter turned to him and said softly, "Daddy, I like it when you're here. Really here." Alexander's heart swelled. "I'll always be here, my love," he promised. Maria, standing quietly nearby, allowed herself a satisfied smile, knowing that her quiet observation and intervention had brought about this profound transformation. Alexander had spent a fortune chasing cures, but the true solution had been right under his nose all along. In simple, patient, loving presence, guided by someone who cared enough to notice the truth. That night, as the family settled into bed, Alexander reflected on the journey. The fortune spent, the sleepless nights, the endless consultations, all had led to this understanding. He finally realized the most valuable things in life could not be purchased: trust, love, understanding, and the quiet strength of those who see what others cannot. In the silence of the house, Alexander whispered a heartfelt thanks to Maria and to life itself, recognizing the profound lesson that true wealth lies not in money, but in hearts nurtured, bonds strengthened, and love freely given. And for the first time in years, Alexander slept peacefully, content in the knowledge that his children were truly safe, truly loved, and truly understood, and that sometimes the smallest voice in the house can reveal the greatest truths.